know that in the 19th century there was a big market for reproductions of sculptures in all media, Parian-ware statuettes and photographs, for example, although casts were just as important, like we have dotted around the building here. And we sort of feel that we understand why we can situate it in a kind of social history of the interest in art, the relationship between the fine and the mechanical arts, the great exhibitions, the rise of mass media, etc. I've been intrigued, however, by the popularity of reproductions, and in particular stereoscopic photographs of statuettes. So here you've got the Greek slave. That's a photograph of, in fact, one of the originals. The one next to it is a Minton Parian-ware statuette. Below it, there is a stereoscopic photograph. And then on the right, I've just added a stereoscopic photograph of the statuette. So why would anybody want to buy the stereoscopic photograph of the statuette if you could buy the stereoscopic photograph of the actual statue? Moreover, there is no attempt in the photograph of statuettes to pass them off as photographs of the statue. So in other words, it's not because the Hiram Powers was withdrawing permission to have his statue photographed, and so people resorted to having to photograph the statuette. You can see that there is actually a mise-en-scène in the way in which the statuettes are photographed. It actually makes it immediately visible that these are small objects. So you can see the pattern of the fabric, the size of the folds, give away size and scale. And the Greek slave is not the only one. I could have brought lots of examples, but that's just another one to give you that sense of another photograph of a statuette that sort of tells you that it's a photograph of the statuette rather than the statue. And as you can see in this different photograph of the Eve at the Fountain statuettes, it's actually quite easy for a photographer to abolish the background and to create this kind of blank abstract space in which we lose the sense of scale, and it's only when we're given other information that we realize that that's a photograph of a small object and perhaps how small it is. So it would have been quite easy for a photographer unable to photograph a real statue to photograph the statuette and to try and pass it off to the customers who might not have seen the original statue as just a photograph of the statue. So my hypothesis then comes to this material at a slightly different angle. Now, many historians of photography talk about it having been a dual invention. So we should not talk about one invention, but in fact two different types of photography being invented at the same time. The colotypes, like the one on the left, patented by William Henry Fox Talbot in England, 1839, which due to their material qualities were more easily valued as pictures. Soft focus on watercolor paper, less detailed, they looked like etchings. In other words, you were supposed to look at them. While the other invention, Louis Daguerre in France, just a few weeks before Fox Talbot, is the Daguerreotype. They're shiny, detailed, and unlike any form of image seen before, except fugitive mirror images. They were also more commercially successful and became associated with the other idea of photography, or rather the other idea of photographs, as documents or windows. You look through them at the scene depicted, or at least that's how historians of photography kind of contrast the two usually. If you have ever seen a daguerreotype, however, unfortunately, I don't have one. They've always been a bit too expensive, as they've gone up in price since I started working on 19th century photography. So as I earn more, they become more expensive. So anyway, if you've ever seen one, they're actually quite strange objects. They're nothing like they look like in reproductions. They're chunky, heavy, and complicated. They feel like, in fact, a telephone, a kind of contemporary iPhone. they're sort of shiny and kind of expensive looking. The image itself is actually unstable. They have to catch the light just so for the image to be visible. Otherwise, it disappears completely, and all you can see is a reflection of your face in the polished, silver-coated copper. Or the image actually, instead of coming up as a positive, comes up as you can see it as it goes through negative, which can be quite weird, especially when you're looking at the sort of a human form, a portrait, or in fact a statue, or a photograph of a statue. So, to me, it was never convincing, this idea that you got a daguerreotype and you just look at what the daguerreotype was of, because actually a daguerreotype is such a strange object that actually calls us attention to itself. There is also a little bit of a ritual involved in looking at them. They come with a cover, you have to open, it's a kind of like clasp, like in a jewel case, and in fact, jewellery cases were what was used, repurposed for the daguerreotypes. You have to open them, and then you have to hold them and sort of twiddle them about to catch the light, and you can see these kinds of the sort of light catching the image in a different way. So it makes you aware of the fact that you're looking at a daguerreotype. You're not just looking at the photograph of the Greek slave or a portrait of whatever, my girlfriend, my boyfriend. So my hypothesis then is that looking through photographs became a habitus a bit later, when collodion plates combined the detailed quality of daguerreotypes with the reproducibility of negative-positive systems as devised by Courtauld. More specifically, the public learned to look through photographs by looking and reading about looking stereoscopic photographs of sculptures. And they could have done, the same experience can also be had with pornography, incidentally. But obviously, it wasn't going to be something that you were going to read about instructions in magazines, how to look at pornographic stereoscopic photographs. But they would have had something similar qualities. As explained in 1851 by David Brewster, who had adapted earlier forms of stereoscopy for photography, quote, "Superficial forms will stand before the viewer in 3 dimensions, and while he summons into view the living realities from which they were taken, he may virtually carry in his portfolio the Apollos and Venuses of Grecian art, and all the statues that adorn the galleries and museums of civilized nations." Another voice from America, this is Oliver Wendell Holmes, who designed the American stereoscope. Quote, "A stereoscope is an instrument which makes surfaces look solid. That effect is so heightened as to produce an appearance of reality which cheats the senses with its seeming truth. By means of these 2 different views of an object, the mind, as it were, feels round it and gets an idea of its solidity. We clasp our object with our eyes, as with our hands, with our thumb and finger, and then we know it to be something more than a surface. The first effect of looking at a good photograph through the stereoscope is a surprise. The mind feels its way into the very depth of the picture," end quote. And in the wake of the 1862 International Exhibition, all the papers agreed that the stereoscope and stereoscopic photographs created an exhibition that was better, more vivid and affecting than looking at the statues themselves. Now, this is what I'm talking about. You might need to twiddle it a little bit like this to adjust it. So that's a sort of a stereoscopic photograph of the full size, or one of the full size versions. So I'm going to explain a little bit what's happening. Looking at a stereograph through a stereoscopic viewer is a slower, more cumbersome process than that of looking at photographs in a book or album. The slide has to be picked up and inserted in the stereoscope. Then the apparatus and the viewer's eyesight have to be adjusted before the stereo effect works. Sometimes it takes a while. The more you do it, the quicker your brain is at making it happen. Once this happens, however, all framing context disappears, facilitating the suspension of disbelief required for the viewer to feel that he or she is experiencing an encounter with the object. The visual sensation of looking at stereographs through the viewer is peculiar. The observer's vision is more than physically isolated from the surrounding space by the frame of the stereoscope. As Holmes suggested, the eyes feel as if they're moving in the space of the photograph. The details in the image, no longer miniaturized, reward leisurely perusal and facilitate complete absorption. Because binocular disparity, on which the stereoscope effect is based, is greater when we look at nearby objects, stereos of a statuette create a stronger three-dimensional effect than looking at the larger statues. And do pass them around so you can have a go at both. So because binocular disparity, on which the stereoscopic effect is based, is greater when we look at nearby objects, stereos of a statuette create a stronger three-dimensional effect than looking at the larger statues. And if you kind of compare the two, and the area, one good area to focus on is a hand and a chain, where you get that effect of the hand popping towards you, and suddenly it doesn't look like she's touching herself. It looks like it comes out to meet you. So because of that, stereoscopy emphasizes the distance between planes, so the figure's chained hands seem to be closer to the observer than they are in the statuette, or than they appear to be in the flat photograph. To feel that, moreover, to feel that close to a statuette, a viewer would have to be so near it as to lose vision of the whole object, something that does not happen when looking through the stereoscope. So I've been able to do that, compare looking at a statuette. To feel that close, you have to be so close to the object that you're actually not looking at it anymore in that kind of sense of its entirety, because you're basically like when you're about to kiss somebody, it's that kind of closeness. But that doesn't happen when you're looking through the stereoscope. You can still see the whole of the figure. The visibility to the camera of the space between the planes parallel to it, here between the chain and the pelvis, creates a vagueness or gap in the 3D effect, giving the impression that there is a bigger empty space between the figure's hand and her body than there is in the actual object. As a result, when looking through the stereoscope, it is easier to fantasize, here for example, slipping one's fingers behind the chain and pulling the young woman towards the viewer, to freedom or to the consummation of the sale. Greek slave was supposed to be a young Greek maiden who'd been kidnapped by the Turks and was being sold into slavery. And yet, the illusion of mastery that might be generated by the miniaturization of the sculpture in the photograph and emphasized by the naked woman in chains is also undermined. As we look through the stereoscope, we become at once large, looming outside the stereoscope with our body, and small inside it with our eyes. Our eyes sharing with the sculpture a space that has been collaboratively created by our visual perceptual apparatus, our eyes and brain, by the stereoscope, and by the foreground object pictured in the stereograph by the statuette. We become, as one writer on stereoscopy has said, like the actress behind the curtain, peeping at an expectant audience, observing, seeing, while at the same time being complicit in making the scene, end of quote. But rather than fingering a curtain to peep, the sensation, I would suggest, is almost like one of fingering our own process of vision itself, which I think is one of the reasons why stereoscopy was so successful in pornographic uses, as well as in the photography of sculpture, and specifically photographs of sculptures of the human body, because there was this kind of almost masturbatory effect of kind of like becoming tactile aware of one's vision. The interplay between physical and conceptual processes is more profoundly interactive than handling actual statuettes would be. In the stereoscope, we make the work in the process of seeing it, mingling our perceptual labour with the valorized work of the artist. The tactile fantasies engendered by this experience are richer and more evocative than touching statues would actually be, as the figure's body and space in the stereograph and one's own body and space unfold into each other, creating a pleasurable one-to-one encounter in which the distances between original and reproduction is no longer meaningful. By making us feel we can almost touch vision, the stereoscope makes us forget the photograph and teaches us to look through it. Thank you.
So on Wednesday, the 18th of October 1617, so a long time ago, the City Council of Antwerp, in the southern Netherlands, so present-day Belgium, they made a significant decision. The document says, "My lords, burgomasters and aldermen have ordered the treasurers and steward to buy from Jan Bruegel, painter, 2 artful paintings representing the 5 senses, on which 12 different leading masters of this city have worked, in order to be given to their illustrious highnesses, our gracious lords and princes." And these are the illustrious highnesses, the Archdukes Albert, that's called the Archdukes, but the Archduke and Archduchess Albert and Isabella, who reigned in the southern Netherlands from 1598 to 1621. And so they were given to, these paintings were given to them, and they were recorded in their hunting palace at Tervuren, which is the palace in the background of that painting, in Brussels, which is quite near to Brussels, in 1620. Just over a century later, in 1731, these paintings, which were very large and very, very expensive, were destroyed in a fire. But 2 canvases, these 2, which were by 1623 in the collection, in the Spanish Royal Collection in Madrid, they're accepted as contemporary replicas of the lost works, and in this paper, without going into detail, I'm going to use them as contemporary replica. The pictures personified sensory perception, as you can see, in relation to an overwhelming abundance of luxury goods in palatial settings, and in relation to depictions of Habsburg palaces in the backgrounds. This one doesn't have a palace in the background, but it has a corridor, probably of Coudenberg Palace in Brussels. But it's important that this one doesn't have a palace in the background, but mostly these census paintings do. One of the 2 paintings, as you can see, depicts sight and smell, and the other one depicts hearing, taste, and touch. Personifications of abstract concepts were thus integrated into rooms richly furnished with material goods, which were depicted naturalistically. So you get a mixture of allegory and naturalism. These furnishings stimulated, enhanced, or referred to the respective senses. In sight and smell, they included fragrant flowers, animals associated with the production or perception of scent, optical measuring and scaling instruments, numerous pictures by Antwerp masters of subjects relating to vision, and other products of nature and art of great visual appeal and scent appeal. So, beside the laden table in hearing, taste and touch, church, there was a variety of musical instruments and a profusion of game and cultivated produce. The walls, hung with tapestries bordered with garlands of fruit, bore pictures relating to the three senses. Although a dozen different Antwerp masters participated in the original pendants, the work as a whole was produced under the authority of Jan Bruegel the Elder, one of Antwerp's most successful and renowned artists. Like his other collaborative paintings, the individual contributions would have been harmoniously integrated into his own precise yet fluent manner, like different voices in a choir. Indeed, harmonious part music is invoked by a songbook in the foreground of hearing, taste and touch. Can you see? It's half there, but it's legible when you actually look at it. Immediately below, this masculine personification playing the lute as well. And it's open to a canon in which the legible fragment of the Latin lyric is in translation, "To my hearing thou shalt give joy and gladness." There is a performance in 4 voices, if I can do it, of this canon. Okay, so the lost pendants. So what I'm trying to say is you've got 12 artists working on this, you've got 2 pendants, you've got 5 senses, and I'm trying to think about this as a kind of polyphony, the idea of a polyphony. They were contemporary, the pendants, with a series which is much better known actually, of the 5 separate senses, by Jan Bruegel and Rubens, dated 16, 17 and 18. In the series of the 5 senses, so these wonderful 5 senses, which are however much smaller than the lost pictures, the same canon appears in the open songbook in the foreground of hearing, so you can see here, along with a folio sheet in which the Latin text of the canon is translatable as "Blessed are they who hear the word of God and keep it." On the music stand in hearing, an open music book displays a dedication to the archducal couple. So here, there. All right, so the Archduke and the Archduchess Isabella, there's a dedication. This dedication speaks of madrigals newly composed. So thinking about these in terms of madrigals. But what I want to propose is that both the pendant paintings and the series of 5 senses were understood not just as allegories of the senses and representations of a realm categorized by sensory perception, but rather as an analogous to an embodied human subject, all right? So then I don't want to think about them as allegories, so allegorical personifications or representations of all of these rooms, but actually analogous to an embodied kind of singing composite subject or presence, embodied presence. And I'll try to explain what I mean. Okay. The concept of the pictorial field as a body, or I think rather as an embodied presence, has been explored in different ways by thinkers including Merleau-Ponty, Louis Marin, Alfred Gell, and Amelia Jones. My argument is that, considered as a whole, so considered together, both the pendants, considered as a whole, and the series of 5 senses, considered as a whole, constituted embodied presence that gave polyphonic voice through the different senses to a hope for everlasting harmony between heaven and earth, divine authority, and the differentiated corporeal body. I'm therefore conceiving of pictorial fields that sing of an ideal union between conceptual and material worlds, between, if you like, the mind, the soul, and the body. So I'm thinking of pictures that sing of themselves, that don't represent anything in the real world. They're singing, expressing, acting in the world. In both the magical form and the early modern psychology of the 5 senses, harmonious unity is constituted through the interplay between different voices or kinds of perception. Aristotle, who was still a towering authority at the turn of the 17th century, proposed a common sense, and I'm sure you all know this already, that made sense of the diverse and discrete information grasped and communicated by the 5 sense organs, integrating perceptual experience into mental capacities. And this is a well-known illustration that I'm sure those people who are sensory people know all about. The influential 13th century Dominican scholastics and Albertus Magnus had formalized Aristotle's ideas into an interaction between the 5 bodily external senses and 5 more abstract internal senses: the common sense, fantasy, the imagination, the capacity to know or evaluate, and memory. One strand of the medieval iconography of the senses visualized the human figure diagrammatically, labeling and sometimes connecting the organs of external sense in the body and those of internal sense in the head. Because I haven't got a lot of time, I'm not going to kind of point it out, but I'm sure you can see what I'm talking about. Now, if we think of the pictures that I'm looking at as human-like presences, the distinctive split compositions, they're so-called split compositions, of Jan Bruegel's census paintings can be seen, or can be argued, to parallel the separation and connection between exterior differentiation and an interiorized authority that is figured by the architecture in the background. Okay? In all of them, so if we just go through the, this is the series of 5 senses, in all of them, except actually for this one, the sense of touch, which is very interesting in a way. Okay, you've got the stage-like foreground and the background with the palace in the background. This is Coudenberg here. Okay. So the foreground in shallow perspective is furnished with a diverse array of items whose meticulous observation, apparent substance, and warm tonality invoke the material world perceived by our different senses. So if you like, I'm making a parallel between that and the external sensory experience of the world. All the background of the senses paintings, except for the pendant sight and smell, consist of a landscape prospect with architectural structures or buildings, all but one of which are recognizable as palaces of the Habsburg archdukes, who exercised authority over the Netherlands. So if we're thinking about this, an early modern, a pre-modern sensibility, where the human subject is a microcosm of the political body and of the cosmos as a whole, you're thinking really about the externalized, if you like, embodied senses with authority being exercised from an interiorized kind of position. Okay? Is everybody with me so far? All the background spaces, including that of sight and smell, are distinguished by a lighter, more ethereal tonality and a slightly freer, more translucent painting technique than the foregrounds. They seem to belong to a different reality or a different arena of experience. Contemporaries would have understood the Habsburg palaces in the embrasures of Jan Bruegel's senses, not only as structures of political authority over the bountiful Netherlands, but also in terms of long-standing architectural metaphors for the human being. Revered authors, including Cicero and Plato, had proposed analogies between a human subject constituted by external and internal senses, so that human subject, and socio-architectural structures such as a citadel. So they made an analogy between that conception of the human being, if you like, the five-sensory human being, and a citadel. The relationship between the external senses and the mental and spiritual faculties within the skull was likened to that between the portals of a city and the buildings inside the walls. In the early 17th century, this latter idea was given renewed impetus by Bartolomeo del Bene's lavishly illustrated Civitas Veri Sive Morum, published in Paris in 1609 and possibly known in the Netherlands. Whilst the city is visualized in a rather similar way to an open skull, as you can see, and dissected brain, the poem describes a spiritual journey undertaken by Margaret of Savoy, accompanied by the sound of music. The party is led by Aristotle from the five portals of the senses, round the various edifices and formal gardens, finally reaching the central citadel. And although you can't see it, those little dotty things are people walking along the paths, and backwards and forwards along the paths. Okay. And the citadel is crowned with five temples of science, five temples which are science, art, prudence, intelligence, and wisdom. Similarly, the abundance of sensory goods in the foregrounds of the census pictures, can be perceived as liminal. So I'm arguing that they are liminal. So they're parega-like, they're liminal. All right. They're frames or parega to and from the palatial temples in the background. Okay. So I'm thinking of them as analogous almost to the sensory portals. And this is difficult for us to think about because you'd say, well, senses are organs, but I'm talking about them as something that's liminal, connecting the body with the outside world. Okay, so in some sense, a way in which they're absolutely in contact with the world. One might think of the royal edifices as like the ventricles or chambers of the brain in which the species acquired by the external senses were combined, processed, and stored as resources for new thoughts, actions, and perceptions. This model of a walled city with pathways leading to and from the sensory portals and the outside world assumes that the interior authoritative mind and soul, that architectural structure in the paintings, assumes that the interior authoritative mind and soul and the sensory body were mutually interactive and constituted of the same stuff. This belief was, of course, to be profoundly challenged by Descartes' assertion in 1637 of a radical split in which thought and consciousness were claimed to be essentially independent of and different in kind from embodied sense experience. So I'm saying in this pre-Cartesian world, and it's very difficult to describe it, especially very quickly, they're thinking, because they thought of spirits moving from the world into the mind, species which were actually kind of images that were given off by the world, they're not thinking about the mind, soul, and body as of different stuff. And if you look at these two images, for me, these images speak much louder than words. There you've got the sense of sight in the city image, with things moving from the outside, open to the outside world, and connected with the inner, if you like, interiorized abstractions that we would call interiority. In the Cartesian diagram, you've got two completely different ways of representation and a gap between the two, and that gap is the thing that we find so problematic. So the thing that is looking at the organ. So we are conceiving of, so I say for Descartes, as for Plato, the senses were not gateways, but bodily organs which could be deceptive, confining reliable access to truth and reality to an interiorized mental consciousness. Of course, the psyche and its relationship with the soma had been much debated since antiquity, and forms of dualist thinking were nothing new. I do not want to repeat the oft-repeated, and then there was Descartes, and everything changed. I mean, people have been thinking about dualism forever, all right, and what's the relationship between, if you like, the inside and the outside, forever. But they were thinking about it in very different ways, they were negotiating it in very different ways. Before Descartes, the psyche occupied a more elevated and authoritative position within the hierarchical great chain of being, but it was not generally considered to be, it was part of the hierarchical great chain of being, and it was not generally considered to exercise absolute sovereignty over a subordinated mechanical sensory body. This pre-modern psyche was a mysterious, complex, interiorized sight that was not only identified with abstractions such as the rational mind and the intellectual soul, but also interacted with the external senses and the perceptible world by means of quasi-physical entities such as species and spirits. There was a reciprocity between inside and outside, the high and the low, just as there was in the body politic and in the cosmos.
Can I ask a question about pictures? If the citadels in some ways are analogous to the internal senses, I wondered if you'd looked at the pictures of the citadels and the palaces within the paintings, and whether there was a way, whether that produced anything else, rather than them just being the citadels.
You mean here, or in the Bene?
So there was one in particular where it was very, if you keep going, we'll say that one. So if you're talking about the paintings as the senses of the gateways and the portals, and the kind of the imagined version of the self is with the internal senses.
It's not exactly. I'm not quite sure that it's that specific. I think it's as it were an interiorized authority. Do you see what I mean? But obviously you've got the internal senses.
But the way it's been pictured in the diagram that you showed is with a kind of citadel in the centre.
Yeah.
And then you have the same there. So you've got that in the centre. And then in that other image that you were just looking at, they've all got the palaces and the citadels in the background. So it's exactly, it's that relationship of the liminal, the portal, to the kind of citadel interior.
So you're saying, have I looked at it in relation to wisdom and so on?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I actually wondered whether because obviously it's quite difficult to see those because they're the background detail.
I haven't looked at the actual architecture, but I have looked at the concept of, for example, in this one, this palace is called Marimont, so it's kind of named for one of the governors of the Netherlands, but also for the Virgin Mary. And I've thought of that and talked about it in this very, very long and dense article that poor old Irene's had to read, as the House of Wisdom, as one of the, if you like, the emblems of the Virgin.
Yeah.
So informed by that print,
model.
yes. So yes, I think I'm not really trying to suggest a kind of the main thing I wanted to get across in this talk was this idea of thinking about the picture as it were structured like a presence, like an embodied presence, and if you like articulating, because it gets away from the idea that they are, if you like, representations of the senses, and works in a fully embodied way, but also another thing that I did want to get across, which I haven't at all really, is that they're both unifying, so you're meant to see them together, but at this particular historical moment, and they are splitting, so that hearing, taste and touch are being split off from sight and smell, and the kinds of categories that we were talking about in the galleries, which are, these so-called five senses that we kind of take for granted, are being reconfigured in relation to one another, and of course they are purely historical categories, which we, in some ways I think need to move beyond. And this is a moment when hearing, taste and touch here, where actually the visual field here is very different from the visual field here, which this is much more of an imaginary visual field, a completely integrated visual field, which is not about consumption in the way that this is. This is more of a modern pictorial field. So I'm talking about actually trying to think about the emergence of different kinds of imagined pictorial fields, which are modern, but they're very different, if you like, from this structure, bodily embodied presence kind of structure, which I think probably is much more common. This idea that people were responding to images as if they were, presences, human presences, or kind of divine presences, human presences, but embodied presences. And then you get this kind of split into the visual and the consumable, the thing. And that's what I'm really on about.
Okay, so to give you a little bit of an idea of what the institution Marais is, I'll run you very quickly through a few things. This is our house. It's a historic house in the old center of Maastricht, in the southeast of the Netherlands. And we commission art, and we signal new trends, and we make exhibitions. This is a work by Francis Alice of an exhibition that just opened 2 days ago, and I put it in because it's a picture you have to see sitting down or lying on the floor, because it's also projected very low on the wall. We have an extensive educational program, also for the very imaginative, very young. We have a really very good restaurant that's Sicilian and Syrian. And we have a lush garden of almost 5,000 square feet. So you understand that the senses for us are really a very important thing to work in. Nevertheless, this is not the reason why we work on the senses. The first reason that we started with this program about 3 years ago is because we wanted to get away from contemporary art centers only believing in a visual cognitive system and then framed by a anti-neoliberal discourse, and we wanted to get back to the possibility that many artists and many other makers were also working with the other senses, but then we needed to, of course, find a theory with it, and that turned to be very hard, but even harder it turned out to be to make an experiential program dealing with the senses. And what I share with you today is not the outcome of prolonged research of documents and artworks, but basically the experience of feedback of audience to the artworks that we've been commissioned for certain exhibitions, and with which we are actually sort of halfway in understanding what exactly happens. So any thoughts are welcome in any direction. When you start with the senses first, or sensory behavior, first you ask many questions and you talk to people who work with sensory materials. And just to give you an idea of how we were running in all directions at the same time, you find out, for instance, you ask yourself, where do I have sensory behavior that's not visual, and I already knew it from the start, etc. Is we can't distinguish between fabrics unless we use our fingers. It has been said already today. A second thing is that you start talking to experts from other fields, and biologists say that even though we might think different, we choose our mates with our noses. And a third thing, yet an entirely different terrain, is that many hospitals in the world set up practice clinics for doctors to be able to use their touch in a more successful way, because it turns out that they don't know very well how to feel the human body, and as a result of that have difficulties making diagnosis. I'll give you a quick run through of some of the projects that we did. We actually never do shows that are particularly on the senses, so we don't ask artists to do something with scent, we don't ask artists to do something with sound, but we ask very particular questions and add layers that make us understand how the sensory system works. And this is, for instance, a project titled Undertones that was about sound works in underground spaces, but the question really was the relation between the body, architecture, and sound. And when you put people together in underground spaces, sometimes very deep, like a deep cave here in Maastricht, there was a magnificent shark work project made by the London artist Kathy Matthews. All kinds of things are happening. Here you have a work by Oscar Munoz. It's a drawing on hot slate with water. It's a vanishing portrait. And this exhibition was about was asking the question whether there was a sensory perception of history possible. This is a picture of a visitor to an exhibition titled Intimacy, and the thing she's wearing on her shoulder is the collection of birthmarks of one of the artists that she reproduced and gave out to people so that they could wear a little bit of her. And this is a project that we just finished with Ferran Adrià. Some of you may know him as probably the most famous cook in recent history, running the El Bulli restaurant just north of Barcelona, who had the propensity to draw when he cooked, and in fact he couldn't cook without drawing at first, and all his preparations for the world of taste are visual, and we made an exhibition about that. So very different kinds of projects. We also partake in the Carnival, which is by far the most sensory festival in the Netherlands, and Maastricht is very famous for it. And we organize a series, Training the Senses, in which we try to do a lecture / workshop / meditation / whatever else, in order to get people to move their bodies and listen to their bodies, and at the same time transmit knowledge. This is Peggy Olieslagers, who's actually at the moment dance dramaturg at the Ramber here in London, and she pairs off with a medical anthropologist who's doing a story, and the visitors actually walked in between them, giving their stories and their exercises. So that's a quick rundown of what kind of projects that we do. You get this beautiful image of the beautiful man in the swimming pool to explain the title. which is shut your eyes and drown the body, because many of our exhibitions are partly or entirely immersive, and we think that immersive exhibitions are in fact a very good way of finding out something about how our sensory system works. And I chose the swimming pool because we all know, of course, that if you jump in the pool of fresh water, that in fact your eyes don't work so very well, but your body opens up to an entire new range of stimuli. But also a little bit because Freud describes it very early on, the immersive feeling, as something oceanic. And we can talk another time about it. I don't think he liked the phenomenon very much, and he's actually quite well, anyways, I'll let that go for now. It's in a civilization with discontents, of course, but I just want to go very quickly to two immersive exhibitions that we've done, two case studies. One is the Winter Anti-Depression Show. We did that about 3 years ago. The reason was really because, of course, the winter depression is the opposite of having your senses being active. And if you talk to biologists and doctors, is anybody suffering here from winter depression, by the way? Yeah, that's about right. It's about 1 in 15 in the Netherlands. It's a depression that is bad in that it can be just as clinically serious as any other depression, but it's good in that it always is over when March or April is starting. The thing that's really interesting about it is that as other depressions, it cannot be cured, that the symptoms can be alleviated, but all the scientific research is about light. So they haven't done, since that solves about 65 to 70% of the cases in terms of alleviating symptoms, they haven't done any other research, even though they know that there's a very primary problem, and that is not only do people not get enough light, they also don't hear the birds and smell the flowers. Very, very primary. So what we did is we brought all these artists and makers together to make an art resort. So there was no speaking about Marais as an art institution anymore, but an art resort. And they made a whole series of rooms. I'll just show you. This is, for instance, a massage floor. So people walked over it and could massage their body while walking. This is a St. John's wort room and all the products you can make of it. St. John's wort is the really traditional herbal medicine for depression. This is a soundscape room where people actually use these mirrors to catch the light and point it to all kinds of sounds that were hidden in the wall. They would compose actually a summer symphony together if they did their best. This is another work by Kathy Matthews. It's a sound bed in which you actually, your body moves on the vibrations of all kinds of sounds. And actually she also came at some days to just, while you're lying in bed, create a soundscape for you. We had a scent room, of course, a very photogenic picture, right? But the most important thing, I guess, is to say about this thing. It was an incredibly popular show, and that shows you when you work with art and sensory, people actually come in drones to come and see it. But the interesting thing about it is that we conditioned the visitor quite a bit. So they had to take off their shoes, and then they were put into groups of maximum of 8 people. And every group had a coach or a facilitator or a guide, I should say. And that guide was not allowed to talk about art. So who made this work, why was it made, etc. There was no answer to that, but they were only there to facilitate experience. So they weren't allowed to talk too much at all, but just bring people through the rooms. And the other thing that's quite important is that we had a lot of feedback from visitors, and very important about it is that the feedback was positive or negative. The strongest thought about this show is that people had to go through it in groups. And the thing is, of course, you immediately realize that as a contemporary art centre, we did something that was entirely against the reflex of art, right? You need to see it alone. You need to know this is the room, that is the work, and here am I seeing it or experiencing it. And the work itself wasn't autonomous either. So both were. The art critics had a difficult time with it, and the not art critics loved the show exactly for that reason. They could go with the group through it and share their experience. Now, why do I think that's a very interesting thing? Because proximity is, of course, very important to the history of the senses, as it's intimately linked to our sense of touch. And I put this picture up just to illustrate that standing near to a stranger does something with our body, right? You don't have to think about it. It's just your skin is moving and telling you, you know, what's going on, what do these people want from me? Do I, you know, am I scared? Am I interested? Is it sexual? Do I need to move closer, etc.? And the brain needs to decode that all the time. And these are the kind of reflexes, of course, where we don't see in a museum generally. And maybe it'd be nice to introduce them into a museum so that it would be a little bit messier and a little bit richer as well. Do stop me when I go over time now. What is really important about it, I think, is whether we can train our sensitivity to a point where we are more attuned to our environment. And I think that there's things to say about the museum that it doesn't do that enough. I'll directly go to the second case study. Davy van Velu, The Relativity of Matter. This is probably the most spectacular show I've ever organized in my life. And the fun thing about it is you can see a snippet of it in London soon, because the Rosenfeld Porcini Gallery has one of his rooms reproduced. It's starting next week, I think, for the frieze. I went to the artist Davy van Velu 2 years ago. He's a very young, very accomplished artist who worked in drawing, video, basically photography, everything. And I said, I'll give the house to you if you make one work. And I invited him to make a total installation for the work. This is the very big studios where he put the work together. He worked for over a year on it, and then he brought it to Maurice, a 350 square meter installation, which completely made the house of Maurice invisible. So we had to move out all the functions of the house, like the reception we moved out into the garden. People made reservations through a website, and then they were collected here, brought by volunteers to the front door of the house, and the front door was closed behind them. Not after they've been told to be very cautious when they're inside, to listen to their bodies when they move through the installation, to not talk to each other and not make photographs, but just focus on the experience they had. And I guess another way of conditioning, and the most important thing, of course, was about it that no more than 2 people could enter the installation every 15 minutes. So this to give you an idea of what kind of rooms you would get into. He made 9 rooms, all quite dark. It's quite difficult to move through. And what's that? Yeah, it sounds good. No, it's not part of this. No. Somebody's talking through this room too. And of course, due to the limited capacity of us to see in the dark, visitors needed to use their bodies to find their way. So they touched, kneeled, squatted, blew, and sometimes they just sit still for a while to feel their surroundings as if by their skins. And most visitors appeared from the installation speechless. The visitors, most of the time, no longer than 20 minutes, but people would travel for 6 hours to be inside of it. And some found it very ghostly, and some actually ran back as soon as they were in. But for those who got to the end, they were quite, you need to leave them alone for a little bit, and when you asked what they had experienced, they said us things that were very unmuseum-like, so they were distant to the world, and they experienced sudden temperature drops, and they smelled all kinds of things. Not things that the artist had put into the installation on purpose. They heard things, and some even, there was a lot of discussion about time as well. People felt outside of time. Some people actually said that they thought they had seen the future when they came out. They're all very I'll show you one of the other. 2 minutes? Yeah, I think I'm actually at the end. So. Well, their sensory experience reminded me of something the philosopher Alfonso Lingas wrote already quite a while ago. And a sensation can be an interruption, a kind of short circuit of our perceptual routines, our calculated timing of the environment. So suddenly you're stopped. It's not like we're not perceiving all the time. But if you come into a conditioned environment like this, the senses can suddenly stop everything that's going, your whole usual perception of going on about things. So then I want to say one last thing, because the thing is, of course, we know that museums, of course, do want to stop us in some way. They do stop us from leading an everyday life, a regular life. And they do want to verify certain experiences, especially visual experiences from the outside. And here then you see a picture that needs to show that to you. And I think the world of gaming already came up. Brought the immersive space back to our attention, and games generally promise, I think, total environments and immersive spaces. But of course they're mainly interactive audio-visual experiences with a slight bit of touch, and incidentally lined with a bit of scent and taste. And their legitimacy for the immersive claim lies, I guess, in the game's combination of strong visuals and addictive competitive incentives. So they suck players into the world. That's the immersive aspect of it. And now my last example to you is, why would it be interesting for a museum to bring back somewhat of the everyday experience that is always immersive into the museum? And I like to end with an example. And you've all been in I always have the New York cab, but of course the London cab is quite as good. But my examples are from New York, so allow me to say, once you're in the center of New York City, let's say on Fifth Avenue, and you're outside, you smell the gas of the cars, right, or the pretzels, and you hear a lot of noise, and you see all the lights. You stop a cab and you go in. If you're lucky, you have an Indian driver with a bit of perfume, you know, or the driver is asking you a bit, or telling you about baseball, or asking you directions. And it smells a little bit different, and your visuals is certainly cornered into a small part. And the sounds have almost all gone. Probably you have either the radio or you have a little gingly gangly music on. And not for a second do you think that you've come from one reality in a totally drastically other reality. Whereas this is, of course, exactly what happens. And I think to make people sensitive to that drastic change would mean to attune them to a sensitivity, to a working of the senses that we now don't have, because our eyes are so perfect in making a continuum, right? Or sometimes our ears. And I think it would be wonderful for modern art spaces or museums to get somewhat of that sensitivity back into the realm of active art. Thank you, and sorry for taking too long.